Welcome back to the Content Matters podcast. I am very happy to have Larry Swanson with me today. Larry has 25 years experience as a content modeler, a digital architect, and a community builder. He is currently the community growth manager at MetaFacts, which is a leading knowledge democratization and AI platform. Hopefully he'll tell us a little bit about what he's doing there. He hosts the Knowledge Graph Insights podcast and co-organizes the Data Worthy Collective, which is a weekly gathering of semantics, ontology, and data professionals. Larry's one of these people who loves to share his knowledge and to talk to people because he has so many communities and events he's part of. He's co-organized a number of professional communities and events, the Knowledge Graph Conference, Connected Data London, Decoupled Days, Utterly Content, the Future of Content Meetup in Amsterdam, the Seattle Content Strategy Meetup, and World Information Architecture Day. And I know just from watching your LinkedIn feed, Larry, that you go to a lot of other events too. And you're also the founding member of the Kinetics Council. I didn't say that word right, Kinetic Council. It's an association formation committee that aims to connect professionals across the data, knowledge, semantics, and content industries. And Larry's joining us today from Heidelberg, Germany. So welcome, Larry, to the podcast.
It's great to be here, Barb. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I think we're going to have some interesting conversations around advice for content strategists and architects on how to develop the skills and the mindset for getting kind of forward in this AI-driven world. And but before we kind of dive in, I'm actually kind of curious to know, how did you get started in doing content strategy and content architecture? What kind of led you to this profession?
Wow, that's like started a log cabin in Illinois. No, it's but it does go back. Specifically, my interest in the intersection of technology and editorial content stuff. My mom was a lifelong journalist. My dad was a mechanical engineer. So it's like kind of inevitable, I think. But so there was also a family heritage. Both my mom and my aunt were lifelong journalists for newspapers and magazines, and they're just a family history of word nerdery. And so I think it was just inevitable that I would do something in content. And I started like in an old-fashioned conventional book publishing world. And then when the web came along, I just jumped right into that because it was, clearly like the next thing. So
really new and cool, and we all knew where it was going. Those of us that were smart and kind of got on board with it anyway, right?
Well, we thought we knew where we were going. It ended up a little differently than I'd hoped, but it's still good.
Yeah. Okay, so let's kind of kick off with a kind of a meaty question in my mind. What is ontological thinking, and why is it so essential that content strategists kind of get their head around it and use it?
Well, I think, it's the first thing I say when I talk about it is everybody's already doing it. Like ontology is just like, it's kind of like mental models. It's just like how you organize stuff about the world and how you think about the world and organize things like, plants and animals and people and, however you organize things. So we're already doing it just sort of natively as human beings, but in our professions too, like everybody in the content world, like whether you're like outlining an article or developing configuring a CMS, there's this whole range of activities that involve like kind of understanding what you're working with, what it consists of, how things within that domain relate to one another. I'm kind of getting into a more formal description of ontology at that point, but it's like, anyhow, I always just say to people, look, you're already doing it. And what I mean by ontological thinking, like you're already doing ontology, but ontological thinking is just more like of taking that and adopting it as a mindset, to think as not like in opposition to anything, but just being aware that thinking about bringing an ontological approach to your work can benefit you. And especially, I think that's just sort of amplified with the arrival and all the kerfuffle around AI, is that it's more important than ever to be clear on how you organize things. It's kind of how we get, in the kind of work that I'm doing now, it's how you get the human element, the human knowledge, independent of the language around it, into AI systems. That's an interesting distinction. We can talk a little bit more about that. But it's so ontological thinking is just like being aware that we're doing this kind of thinking and kind of consciously cultivating. And there's a few things about it. Like if you think about the way professional ontologists operate, they have this both sort of top-down view of the world, of their work, of like how things are organized in their organization or whatever context they're doing their work in. How, and just sort of the technical and cultural infrastructure that you operate in, but what you intend to do, like what do you need your ontology to do? There's this sort of top-down intent about how you need and want things to be organized, but then there's this bottom-up thing too, of just looking at all the instances, like what do you got there? And I think, again, it's something we all do. I don't know that we all do it, but it's a really common pattern to like both look at like what you want to accomplish and then what you actually have to work with, meeting in the middle. And the middle is kind of defined both by what you discover in both the top down and the bottom up part, but also by how you scope the domain that you're operating in. Like, like one of my favorite examples, a friend of mine is working on a book about modeling, about domain modeling. And he talks about like if you look at the concept of a domesticated animal, well, like a pet owner and a veterinarian and a pet store owner look at that same thing quite differently and might have a different take on it. So that kind of gets at the importance of thinking about how you, what they call scoping the domain in an ontology practice, but just in your work, it's like just thinking about like, okay, which view am I taking on this field that I'm operating in right now? So that's it's a term I've heard other people use, like a guy at the IA conference a couple of years ago, Ren, the famous information architect in California. I think he's based on his last name right now. Really brilliant guy. He did a whole workshop on ontological thinking, half-day workshop. So it's something you can spend a lot of time on as well.
It sounds like it might be hard to kind of document because there might be a lot of moving parts you have to think about and kind of put together.
That's a good point. And there's sort of like, it's really interesting too, that like there's sort of two heritages that are particularly concerned with, I don't know, not necessarily concerned with ontology per se, but like that notion of like, there's this important part of both knowledge engineering, which is kind of the world I operate in now, that notion of properly building an ontology and capturing the knowledge around it. But there's also probably a bigger field and more, better known field of knowledge management. And that's, in knowledge management, they often capture like, in both are concerned with just capturing the tacit knowledge that's in people's heads. Like if you hear somebody say, "Oh, just ask Jane; she knows how to do that," or you get these little cues about the things that are just in people's heads and not out yet. Like in knowledge management, they're often articulated like in documented in like wikis or things like that. In the field of knowledge engineering, where I now operate, it's more explicitly and specifically captured. But in either case, you're just making the tacit explicit. And that kind of gets at the fundamental intent of ontological thinking. Well, that and also this notion that the folks at Google articulated is the idea of things, not strings. Like, and this is something that I think is a not a leap, but a mindset shift that for a lot of content people is we're word people. And we're very used to language and talking about things and talking about things in the words that we describe them with. But in ontology engineering and ontology design, there's this distinction between the thing you're talking about. Like the best example would be like a table. In English you say a table, in Dutch you say tafel, and in Spanish you say mesa. It's like same thing, different labels to associate it. So that notion of being clear on the concepts you're working with over the language that describes them, and being aware that a lot of that knowledge about what that thing is stuck in people's heads, and you got to get it out. Those are sort of two foundational parts of that mindset, I think, is that being clear that like on the concepts versus the words that describe them, and the knowledge you need is often tucked away in somebody's head, and you need to get in there and figure it out. That's like, UX researchers are really good at this kind of stuff, figuring out that kind of thing. So
yeah. Lisa says Ren Pope. That's who you're referring to.
I'm so embarrassed. I hope he's not watching because I love the guy and I just can't remember. I forgot his last name. It's Ren. It's just that big guy in the front of the room talking about ontology. Yeah. Sorry, Ren.
All right. So that's ontological thinking. And then we have this idea of LLMs, large language models, and generative AI versus symbolic knowledge-based AI? They're similar but the same, different things?
Different things. They're different. They're kind of the two major fields within the broader discipline of AI. I mean, right now, it kind of really bugs me to no end that like everything that ChatGPT and Anthropic and all the big AI companies talk about, they just say AI about that, which is true. It is AI, but it's only part of the AI story. And most of what they're doing on that, it's sort of like that all comes out of the neural network work that started like in the, it's probably the oldest kind of AI. It's been around since 1945. That was when the first insights around, hey, we could mimic human brain structure with computers. And that has been a slowly growing field. It had a real spike about 2.5 years ago with the arrival of ChatGPT 3, I guess, whatever. Anyhow, the one where they just really took off. So that world is all about that attempt to mimic the human brain and how it operates. Led to this a whole bunch of math that I don't understand about doing, algebraic things to learn stuff. Basically, I'm grossly oversimplifying and probably misrepresenting it, but it's basically about the attempt to apply neural network insights into helping machines learning. It's sometimes one of the big parts of that field is machine learning. Machines learning stuff. So that's the sort of, and that's the key word there, is they learn things, they figure stuff out by looking at tons of data. That's like one of the big problems in that world is like they're running out of data to feed the foundation models that need, they need all the data in the world so that they can predict, and that's what they do is they predict the likely thing that will be next. So they're really good at recognizing patterns. They're also quite good at recognizing human language. So that which permits them to become these like natural language interfaces to computers. And so that's some of the stuff they're good at is pattern recognition, text, content generation, and that sort of conversational interface. Those are some of the features of them that make them, really, one of the fastest growing parts of the technology world right now. But the other side of the AI equation is the symbolic AI. And what I mean by that is like, in the learning side, information is represented as vectorized tokens that are, kind of mathematically computed to find out, which ones are like other ones and which ones are likely to come next. On the symbolic AI side, things are represented as symbols, as numbers and characters, and symbols that computers can read and also the humans can understand. Like that's the beauty of and this is the connection between ontological thinking and symbolic AI is like an ontology is the foundation of the knowledge representation part of AI that I operate in. And what that means is like you're representing knowledge in a way with symbols that computers can read and humans can understand, so that you can ensconce known things. And there's kind of two main kind of things. They're just like scientific facts and stuff like that. Like machine learning stuff doesn't know any of that. They don't know that like big things don't fit inside of small things. They might have seen a lot of language about that concept, but they don't know that concept. Whereas a knowledge representation gets that like, if you, and there's just a huge number of examples of that, but just that kind of thing that like any 2-year-old knows, that most LLMs do not know that. They don't know anything. They could learn that and figure it out by looking at a bunch of data about things around that. But so the symbolic AI side is that you represent knowledge with symbols in ways that you can do really cool stuff with computers to share facts. That's the important thing about it. One of the, I mentioned the benefits of LLMs, but some of the downsides of the machine learning side and the learning side is their proclivity to hallucinate and to just make things up and to be sort of, there's a whole bunch of details about like, how they're trained, the guardrails that are putting around them, how they're fine-tuned, system level prompts, how good your prompts that you write are. There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into that, but you can't just ask an LLM like, hey, even something like the president of the United States, depending on the training data, it might say Joe Biden, if it's a 2-year-old data set that trained it.
Yeah, exactly.
So whereas in knowledge representation, you consult authoritative, current and accurate and human vetted knowledge sources. But the real action is the intersection of the two, which is becoming like a thing. It's not as big a thing as I hope and think it will become, but it's this notion of like, well, hey, we got this thing that's really good at conversational, understanding natural language. And the other thing is it knows a ton. Like these LLMs know, like they've read millions of lines of SQL code and Cipher queries and Sparkle queries and all these ways that you can access that kind of knowledge that's in there. So one of the first benefits and obvious connections between these things is you can use an LLM to understand a human request, turn it in to like a query, and then you can go to that authoritative knowledge source and say, hey, what's the gross national product of Kenya? And go to and look that up rather than guessing it from a bunch of data that you looked at. So that's the kind of sometimes that combination is sometimes called neurosymbolic AI or hybrid AI. There's a bunch of other labels that are starting to emerge, and there'll be a lot of new buzzwords, I can pretty much guarantee you, to describe that. But it's basically that the complementary nature of these technology stacks, these not really stacks, but like technology paradigms, is kind of driving almost everything that's going on in the world right now, I think.
Yeah, but it's interesting how much some people rely on just the LLMs for their knowledge. Yeah. But I assume that the really smart companies are connecting the two parts together to get the right answers to the right things.
Exactly, and there's places where the stakes are so high that you just can't rely on an LLM. Like banking and finance, it's like you can't rely on them, or like medical care and pharmaceutical research and things like that, where you need actual facts doing that. I mean, they still benefit from the LLM, from the machine learning side and the cool capabilities in those conversational agents. But so it's already there in companies like. Like I said, farm is probably the best example, and finance. Those are probably the two classic examples. But starting to see it more and more in like industry and manufacturing, like supply chain management. It's like if you order a screw for a very particular, turbine part in some electrical generation plant, that better be the right size. And again, you can use an LLM to help the procurement people say what they want, but that's turned into a query that goes into an actual, data source about some probably industry vetted, thing about like the characteristics that you have to have in that kind of screw or something like that. So the technologies are already coming together.
Yeah, we had a question for you. Chris is wondering, I'm curious about how ontological thinking relates to object-oriented UX. Going through the course right now, and it sounds familiar from a high level.
Yeah, well, OOUX, and I've talked to Sophia a lot about that, and been in that world. It's the thing about OOUX. It's kind of like it's interesting. It comes out of that sort of object-oriented programming paradigm, and this gets really deep. Like my sort of intellectual take on object-oriented OOUX is that it's often sort of stops at the object level, whereas in knowledge representation, especially RDF-based knowledge graphs, RDF is a W3C specification, kind of like HTML or CSS, that describes it's literally how you describe it. It's called a resource description framework. So it describes how you describe data in that. So in terms of modeling, I think OOUX, it's like any other IA practice, where you're information architecture practice, where you're identifying the things in a domain, how they relate to one another. The thing about the computerized graph technology, that both underlies like property graphs as well as RDF-based graphs, is there's a more you can connect more things. It's probably more detailed than what we want to go into here, but there are connections between those, and it's just sort of like there's levels of abstraction as you go down. And one of the things about the RDF-based knowledge graph stuff that I work with is that there's this insane amount of computational power available to you when you articulate things at this very simple level, like the RDF resource description framework is just, and this is another thing that's going to be very familiar to word people, like content people, subject, predicate, object. It's like Larry knows Barb. And you can represent it that way. You could represent that in a table in a SQL database, like people Larry knows is the name of the table, and there's a row called Barb, and one of the things it has is like her URL for this call we're on, or something like that. But it's and similarly, and I think the closest thing to the closest analogy in graph technology to OOUX would be like a labeled property graph, where you have like these nodes that are objects that contain information, but in an RDF graph, that information would be kind of abstracted out in a way that you can just do more with it. You kind of have to dive into each of those things, into the nodes of a property graph or the tables in a relational database. Whereas in RDF, the data is just out there ready to be connected. That's one of the big concepts that comes out of that world. It's sometimes known as the semantic web, is the original concept of a lot of these technologies. And one of the big principles there is this notion of linked data. And not just linked data, but also the metadata about it. That's another kind of distinguishing thing about RDF, is that it's both like the graph format that the stuff is stored in, as well as a computable language, this RDF framework that just makes it unique, makes it a lot harder to learn. It's a lot harder to, I talk literally every day to colleagues about the challenges of onboarding people to the stack, but it's worth it. It's the computing power, as like, people like, like the finance companies and pharma companies, and invest millions of dollars in these knowledge systems, because they give you the more powerful results.
Yeah. It's funny. I'm going to ask another question that kind of just takes me. The more I hear you talk, the more I think, maybe in my mind, a content architect or a content strategist wasn't a simple job, but wasn't complicated. But when you start talking about semantic technologies and ontologies and knowledge base, you start to realize how much these people need to know and understand to do their jobs really well. And it's super.
Yeah, well, that's when I said how it's notoriously difficult to onboard people. Most of the people I work with and talk to have PhDs, and they've studied like this pretty deeply. And that's the same true in the machine learning side of things too. I think there's many more folks with just like master's degrees, like software engineers doing the different parts of it. But I think there's a real high level of intellectual rigor, which again, that high level of intellectual rigor in the practice of ontology is what makes this stuff so powerful. These are one of the languages built on top of RDF is OWL, the web ontology language, which is based on description logic, which is really tight thinking about what you can do with knowledge about a thing. And so, yeah, it makes for a delightfully nerdy bunch of conferences and stuff to go to, but it does require a little more onboarding. But at the same time, and this I think is more germane to what we're talking about today, about there's so many skills in that field that kind of fall to these ontologists now, and they're often called ontology engineers, but they do a whole range of stuff that includes things that content strategists and content designers and technical writers routinely do as part of their jobs. This like talking to people about how they talk about stuff, clarifying language. And then there's all these levels of sophistication about how you can codify that understanding of how people talk. You can have just a simple list. That's real common in like faceted searches or things like that, where you just say, no, we just have this list of colors or dimensions or, whatever the things are. And this gets into what's called the semantic spectrum, because this is sort of there's this span of semantic practice that kind of culminates with ontology, but there's a lot of stuff that is equally powerful. One of the people who wrote that original semantic web article and is one of the real founders of the field of this tech, Jim Hendler, often says, he's really well known for saying, a little semantics goes a long way. And this is one of those things that we already know. Like if you are just sitting there with a word salad, bunch of folksonomy tag terms that a bunch of people have added, it's hard to do much with that. But if you say, no, we're going to control this vocabulary and just talk about things this way and give people a choice to talk about that, you tame your infosphere a little bit more, and then you can create like a taxonomy. And probably almost every content person I know at some point has had to create like okay, we got this list, but that goes with that, and that kind of is underneath that conceptually. And so you sort of organize things hierarchically, typically in a taxonomy. And then you sometimes get to the point where like, in like an, like a specialized field or something where you're like, oh, not everybody knows what that term means. So you need a glossary, a way to describe the terminology you're working with. And so anyhow, and all of those things can be accounted for with various RDF technologies. That doesn't have to be RDF. You can just have a CSV file or a Word or a Google sheet that has a taxonomy in it and do a lot of stuff. I've done a lot of that in a lot of content modeling projects. But we're already, just as we're all already ontologically thinking, virtually every content person I've ever met with or talked with has done a significant amount of work somewhere along that semantic spectrum of like controlling vocabularies, organizing concepts and terms, and defining them, so that people can use them, getting very close to proper ontology work.
Yeah. Is that kind of also where you talk about this role of a conceptual semantic layer? Like you have to kind of understand how that fits into your architecture and your systems?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because I'm kind of smiling and laughing because it's like, it's really simple to grasp, but it's one of those architectural metaphors. It's not like a product you can go buy. But there's a lot of people now who articulate like an enterprise architecture. Like I've talked about this, and to kind of ground it in like content. Like the way I've talked about this idea for years is that like when you're assembling, I've done a lot of like assembling complex content experiences where you're, getting data from a database about prices or something, for, an offer that you're crafting or, crafting on the fly. So you're accessing both data and then content, whether it's content that drives the experience like UX strings, or whether it's specific content about an instance of a thing like a hotel property description or a recipe ingredient or something like that. So there's these the different sources, and then also media assets, that you're drawing on. And each of those three is sort of like what people in these architectural, enterprise diagrams would classify as kind of data, content, media assets. That's all what some people would just call data. That's the data layer, that's the instance layer, that's all the stuff you have to work with. And then the semantic layer is the one right above that. And some people would put at the bottom of the semantic layer a metadata layer, where you have all the attributes and characteristics of the things you're working with, which is really essential. You have to have a metadata strategy to do any of this kind of work. And then the other thing in that semantic layer is those, all those semantic things I just talked about, taxonomies and ontologies and control vocabularies with thesauri. Those things are all potential parts of that semantic layer. But basically the semantic layer is the understanding layer, I think, and it can be even simpler, not simpler, but like more simply articulated, like the guys at Factor, Bram Wessel and Gary Carlson talk about just the information layer. That's another way to look at it. It's like you have the things and then you have the information about them. That's another equally valid way to talk about it. And then the top layer of all these things is either like, analytics, looking at all you've got and doing something with it. But in the content world, especially the content design world, the common thing at the top is the application layer. That like all this content, media assets, and data in service to what? Oh, this user experience where somebody's trying to book a hotel room in Boston and they just need to know, does the room have a safe? Because my boss won't let me leave my laptop, that kind of stuff. So that's sort of, that's the semantic layer is kind of the middle, the connecting layer in those kind of descriptions of enterprise architectures.
We talk a lot about, we talk a lot about how companies need to get their data in order for AI to really work good. Yep. But I think that we need to kind of extrapolate on what that means, because it's not just the data, but it's the metadata and it's the semantic layer. And all of that stuff is really critical for AI to be able to do something really well with it.
Absolutely. I think, and what's really cool about LLMs is they can do a lot. They can just read a bunch of PDFs and raw text files and markdown files and figure out a lot of stuff. But they're figuring it out. It's like, why would you waste all your time figuring it out when you know it already and you have it represented as knowledge? So that's the architectural challenge, I think, and this is something I'm talking to, like, some friends in executive roles about, like, even like executive education around this, because I think there's going to be a lot of need for, pretty nuanced architectural decision-making at pretty high levels in organizations about how this stuff comes together. I think most of us in content roles, we won't be at that level, but I think it's important for us to understand these things that are going to be going on. And that semantic understanding, and to what you just said, having the metadata component of that semantic understanding is just going to be crucial to, especially in the world we have increasingly decoupled architectures and headless CMSs and composable commerce and composable content experiences. You need to have this kind of ontological thinking mindset, understanding of data and how it fits in and how it's connected to that semantic layer. And this kind of gets to what you just asked about, like data. I think of it as like data hygiene or data practices. Like, in fact, I've been running for a couple of years now, a group I've been participating in for years called the Data Worthy Collective. And we're mostly about ontology practice, but one of the big things we talk about there is data literacy, data hygiene, the importance of metadata strategy and all that. This is like crucial to any of this stuff working. And there's a lot of details to it, like a lot of data engineering stuff. It's like engineer level stuff. This is something that I think a lot of content people are less comfortable with the engineering than I've always, like I said, my dad was an engineer. I've been around it my whole life. It's second nature to me, but I think a lot of content people come more out of literature and the humanities, which is great. It's what we bring to the game, and it's helping things a lot. But I think, especially as we get into this world where some of the conversations you have around crafting metadata or participating in metadata strategies, you'll want to be a little more comfortable talking to like engineers and analysts and people closer to that messy pile of stuff at the bottom of these systems. And the thing about that is to what the question you just asked about, it's crucial that you have good, clean, understandable, explainable data and part of that understandability is metadata about it. And it won't be like the province of too many. I only know a few metadata strategists at like places like Bloomberg and the BBC and stuff like that. It's not a common role, but everybody's got an implicit metadata strategy at least. And a lot of the metadata, like tagging stuff and figuring out how to organize things, a lot of that's going to fall to content people and information architects and folks like that. So again, that's one of those places where there's like opportunities, I think, in this new world, that there'll be more demand for that kind of like metadata and data tidying that isn't like a part of our day-to-day jobs now that we're really extremely well suited for.
Yeah. Well, that leads to a really important question that I had, which is when we start talking about the skills that content professionals, whether they're architects or strategists or even technical writers, I think kind of are important to talk about. Like, what would you say are the 3 skills they should kind of get kind of up to date and relevant, understand and learn that are going to keep them relevant as companies start saying, we have an AI tool for that. We have an AI.
Yeah, no, that one, let me get to 3. I took some notes after we talked to prepare for this, and I've got a list of like 20. but I would say, no, but seriously, I think among the top skills would be like the field I come out of, like much of what I've done over the last 25, 30 years has been content modeling. And that's a pretty, it's like information, the way, I don't know how many of your listeners have discovered this, but like it's just been really distressing in the UX field over the last 20 years to see information architecture kind of drift further and further into the background. I mean, it's still crucial. It still happens at some level. It's kind of, again, it's tacit, it's implicit in all these, product and content architectures, but it's like, oh, come on, it should be higher up. And similarly, content modeling, anytime you like configure a CMS or design any kind of a content system, you need to model the content you're working with. And that's the quickest gateway into this. Like that's, when I got into the ontological world about 5 or 6 years ago, I was like, oh, this is really familiar. This is like, totally familiar because I've been doing content modeling. So if you have friends who do like, and they might be called content strategists, content designers, content architects, information architects, some kind, it's often like somebody in UX who's doing it, but to the extent you can hang out with and discover and read up on, there's a page on my website about, content modeling resources going back to like Cleve Gibbon and Rachel Lovinger's early work in articulating it. Then books like Mike Atherton and Carrie Haynes' book, Designing Connected Content, Karen McGrain's book, Content Strategy for Mobile, and Sarah Wachter-Bechter wrote a book called Content Everywhere. So there's a number of good and what's crazy is that those books are all like 10 or 12 years, 15 years old at this point. So the knowledge has been there right in plain sight the whole time. Many people have read those books, but it's a good time to revisit that. So I think content modeling is like the most direct analogy and maybe the quickest way to find a path from like content practice into whatever, I don't even know what to call these new practices in the AI world, but whatever is coming. So content modeling, and closely related is information architecture. Like I said, it's a skill that's kind of like been kind of dissed, I think, over the last 10 or 15 years, really. It's just kind of fizzled a little bit, but the Polar Bear book is still out there. There's a lot of good information from people like Donna Spencer. I think her book is still free. She wrote a really good book, and Lisa Marquez. There's again, a number of really good books out there, really easy to quickly get on top of the principles of information architecture. And then another thing is, like I said, like metadata strategy. There's not much at all out there. Michael Andrews has written a couple of books. Forget the title. They both have metadata and content in the title. It's really easy to find them. And Michael, he's, in terms of people to follow, he's like, especially in terms of metadata strategy for content people, he's just the guy. So those like content modeling, information architecture, metadata strategy, and just metadata skills, just getting on top of the concept of metadata and turning it as quickly as possible into part of your strategy. Like, what are we going to need to know about what we're working with to do these fancy new things with AI? That's the other thing. It's not just AI. There's other stuff you can do with it as well.
Yeah. And you said like getting that, understanding it from a kind of a technical fluency aspect, to start kind of hanging out with the engineers and learning kind of how to talk to them and ask them questions.
Yeah, that's sort of like the skills development part of it, would be just spending more time with like, especially the and it's hard to find content engineers, but they're out there. Yeah. But also like machine learning engineers and what I found, like I did for a while, I did, I don't know, 40 episodes of a podcast about content and AI specifically. And what I discovered in conversations with people like Laura Costantino at Google and Sharon Nee at Cisco and Andrew Stein and a bunch of people like this, is that there's a lot of places AI is just freaking out content people, but they and many other people are discovering that as you get into that and start working with machine learning engineers, and in the case of Andrew, he was working like with executives. He became like an in-house expert on AI. So he was like not like fighting for a seat at the table. He's getting calls from the C-suite asking him, what to do. So there's some real benefit in learning that. But so that there's a lot of the native skills that we have there. I discovered in that series of interviews is like stuff that there wasn't any real pattern to it. There was kind of a pattern, like a lot of the people working in content design with machine learning experts, they were like, oh, about language. We're building language models. Just little obvious connections like that. But also just a lot of stuff about training data and the most obvious thing in that world is like writing prompts. This notion of prompt engineering, like that. Remember, like I think it was January of 2023, we were talking about the new $300,000 a year job, prompt engineering. And it's still a thing. I think Scott Kuby did a great post on LinkedIn about this the other day. He goes, hey, maybe what we're learning as we learn about AI is just how to tell people what we want better. And that's kind of what prompt engineering is. But there's also the thing about that is that prompt engineering, there's like that kind of user level prompting. But there's also just one layer down from that is system prompts that, in these systems that are being built. And I know a lot of people like in the conversation design world, that's something it's not really a skill, but it's like an adjacent field that people might explore if they're not finding traction in the content world. This world of conversation design, very much like content design or content strategy, it's more about like, you kind of have to understand the principles of conversation, like turn taking. There's all these, but that's really, again, Rebecca Evanhoe and Diana Dybel wrote this great book. What was that? I can't remember. Conversation with Machine. Anyhow, it's an easy book to find, and there's others out there. Preston So wrote a book as well. It's not hard to get on top of and to see the connection between content design and content strategy and conversation design. So it's kind of a long-winded way of saying there's just a lot of connections there, and it's like it's not like there's a clear career path, development path. This is all new and we don't know exactly how it's going to unfold. But all those are examples of places that it's turned out that language skills and content skills are useful in that world. And like I said, most of those examples I got from that podcast were around the LLM side of stuff. I've discovered more like in my work in the knowledge representation side of it is that like what I was saying earlier, like those content modeling skills, information architecture, metadata strategy, those are, it's much more of a one-to-one thing, but it's also, in some ways that's a tougher market to infiltrate because you need the technical skills. You need to be conversant in RDF and at least like, understanding what RDF is and at least working conceptually. There's tools like the company I work for and others build tooling to make building the models that drive knowledge graphs and these symbolic tech easier. So there's going to be opportunities there, but I'm not seeing them as clearly as I'm seeing other, kind of these adjacent opportunities that are emerging just as people try to build chat bots and conversational tooling and go like, oh, they often get to the point where we need somebody who knows about words here. And that's where the content people come in. I can't give you job descriptions or specific roles, but that's kind of the basic idea.
Yeah. Chris says, we keep running into data silo blocks when trying to build AI agents, like pulling from Seismic and Salesforce and other repositories. So trying to work through it definitely exposes the gaps and opportunities on many levels.
Totally. And if you want to nerd out on that, there's a guy in the semantic tech world, Dave McComb, who has written 2 books. First one is called, something Wasteland, the Data Wasteland, but it's about the problem of data-centric the application-centric mindset in organizations. That's where these silos are built, is that people just kind of tunnel down to get the data they want for the application they're building. Dave advocates in his second book, which is called The Data-Centric Mindset, I think, which is this notion of having data curated by the people who own and understand it, and then creating like data products or things like that and exposing those. I don't know what the opportunities might be for content people in that world, but that kind of conceptual work around teasing out it's kind of like that thing's not strings. It's analogous to that notion of teasing out the data and working with that separately. This is more like a thing for data engineers and engineering folks in general, but there's something in there. I'm not articulating it well, but there is, but that notion, this is another maybe way more generic skill that a lot of content people have, is that not silo busting, but silo spanning, ability that we have by talking to a variety of stakeholders, figuring out what's going on, coming up with strategies and crafting plans to address that. That generic skill is going to become really important in spanning those silos to go like, well, we need that kind of data and that kind of data. Why are they so far apart when they're so similar to the needs I have? That generic ability to connect people across an org will come in handy.
Yeah. So what about the content organization? Like, should they structure themselves a certain way to be more flexible and adaptive as all these, AI evolves, semantics technologies are going to evolve? Like, how do they set themselves up for success?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't know, to be honest. I think content has been so mishandled in most enterprises. It's just thought of as like, oh, it's a magical thing that comes out of marketing or tech talks or wherever. And so there's not really architectural paradigms in place. I mean, look for places that Cruz Saunders and Simple A have done consulting, or that Nazar Bina has done work, that places where the content is really well modeled, and there's more likely to be systems in place there. to model this kind of thing. But there's a couple things about this, and this comes up across all the technology stuff I've been involved in, is that one, it's all bespoke. Like every organization is different, has different needs, different, their CTO has different ideas about how to do stuff with technology. Just there's all these things that make for a unique technical architecture, like just enterprise architecture across the board. So it's really hard. There's no like products you can buy or really well articulated best practice. I've been going to school lately on enterprise architecture, and the first thing you learn there is like, it's even worse than you thought, or not worse, but I mean, it's even more diverse and more bespoke than you could have imagined. So there's no like one way, but the one thing I would say is to, this notion of decoupling content from its presentation, it's a really tricky thing. I've been working with it for years and trying to advocate for it and implement it, but it's really challenging in that, there's like the intent and the purpose of the content being managed separately in a headless CMS makes a lot of sense. But then you still have the channel needs, the need to have channel experts, people who understand the capabilities of the channel, whether that's like mobile and voice and conversational bots and kiosks or whatever those things are. There's this really easy and simple to quickly grasp decoupling thing, but then the details are so, and again, you combine the inherent conceptual difficulty of that with bespoke architectures everywhere. I can't offer a lot of advice about specifically how to do that. I think again, it's cultivating those abilities to work across silos and disciplines, and have a little better technical understanding of what's going on that'll help content people thrive in those kind of situations. But I don't know that any executives are going to come asking us for advice about enterprise content architecture anytime soon. That's just like tragically absent conversation.
What do you think, like looking ahead, like 2 to 3 years, is there an emerging semantic or AI technology that really is going to impact content strategy?
I don't know exactly how it's going to impact, the parts of the content world have been dramatically disrupted, by the ability to generate content so quickly and cheaply. We're seeing a backlash, like I've seen a number of posts recently about companies hiring copywriters to clean up kind of crummy Gen AI content. That's another one of the disadvantages of that model. Like when you learn on everything in the world and just kind of regurgitate it and then learn from that, there's this flattening out, and this like, the thing that a good writer brings to the game is completely lost in that scenario. And so people are discovering that. So I think, my hopeful thing is that there'll be a little resurgence of interest in human crafted, original content. But I think it's more likely that we're just going to see more and more technical implementations and attempts of organizations to automate this stuff. So get on top of like the core essence of your craft and get really good at that and articulating that to people and explaining it not only to people, but to computers. Like that's where like, training language models or working with an ontologist to describe a content ontology or something like that, or just even getting conversant with different parts of that semantic spectrum, like getting better at taxonomy and thesaurus and glossaries and things like that. All those kinds of specific skills. But in terms of like, I don't know how it's going to pan out. It's hard to say. I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't know exactly how it's going to pan out.
Yeah, I like this idea, Chris. I'm thinking of utilizing something like Tableau or Snowflake to create a unified content repository, if only to see content assets and their respective tags in one dashboard.
Yeah,
you can put your AI agents there. Yeah.
Yeah, well, no, that's interesting. And I just recorded a podcast for my Knowledge Graph Insights podcast last night with a guy who has, it's not exactly this kind of idea, but like the idea of, and thinking of just like Tableau or Snowflake exemplars of like a kind of thing you can do something with. But there's this notion of like, I don't know if you've heard of MCP, this model context protocol that Anthropic created. So he's using, and I just thought of that as like an LLM thing, like a way for these new emerging agent architectures to communicate with one another. But he kind of, the thing that makes that model context protocol work is like this client server model. So he built an RDF Explorer, a server that serves up RDF information about a particular domain or a technique for doing stuff. And so that, I think architecturally, like that question was definitely on the right track of thinking like, and that sort of gets at like that notion of a semantic layer. Like where can we gather our understanding of these content assets that we have to work with in one place and then do something with them? That's the exact right way to think about it. The exact details of how that sorts out, yeah, it's to be TBD.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm sorry, I'm gonna walk around a little bit because I just noticed that my battery is dying, so I'm gonna run get my, sorry.
That's okay. We're gonna wrap it up in a few minutes anyway, because it's been a good conversation. So this is great. I'm hoping that our content strategists and architects that are listening in have gotten lots of great advice and insights. So what are you kind of working on next? What kind of stuff are coming up? Podcasts, events? Is there a podcast topic that you would love to kind of dive into next?
Well, something I haven't discovered enough of yet in the knowledge graph world. There's to me some real obvious content management opportunities that arise from the RDS stack. People like Michael Ian Tosca, that's another good person to follow. If you just want to get on top of like the nerdiest, deepest implementation and connection of semantic technology to content stuff. And he does really, this is kind of like more than like any headless CMS or Tableau or something like that. Thinking about, he's done this work on what he calls DOM graph rag, which is like taking the semantic stuff that's built into the DITA XML standard that a lot of enterprise, tech docs are in. And because it's got built-in semantics, it's naturally tailored and works really well with knowledge graphs. So just that, again, but these are all just kind of manifestations of that conceptual idea of the semantic layer. Like, what do I got here? What do I want to do with it? How do I connect it? And so that it's kind of, and this is where the ontological thinking comes in. It's like, how do I think about connecting that stuff? And that's where your ontological mindset is going to help a lot.
Yeah. It's there's so much to think about. And as a content writer, I know that there's opportunities for AI, but I know that there's opportunities without AI that we need to kind of figure out what is the marriage that works the best. And I'm seeing that for content strategists and architects and people on the technical side of content, it's kind of the same story. Like, don't say, oh my God, I can't use it, I'll never use it, or I'll never need it. But look at how all these different technologies fit together to help you do the best job you can.
Exactly, and that's the exact right attitude and approach. But then when you look at the details of actually doing that, it's like, holy crap! If we're all inundated, I mean, information overload was already out of control, and now it's like, and I don't know about you, but like I try to equally follow, like industry news and like the technical details of like the new stuff that's coming. But I also follow like the critics of AI, because it's not to be a naysayer, but to understand the limitations of the tech and figure out ways like, the ethical concerns that arise with like, biased training data and the applications of a lot of this stuff, just that kind of stuff. So I read, it's like all I do. I literally wake up in the middle of the night, reading LinkedIn, it's kind of a pathology. I wouldn't recommend that as the way to do it. What I would recommend is some advice I got the other day from a very wise person, was to like focus, like to learn enough about the general milieu and what's going on, and to go like, I think I'd be pretty good at this part or that part, or I'm really curious about this part or that part, and really digging in. Because, Jared Spool and people like that say that the age of the specialist is going away, and we're going to all need to become a little more generalist, which is music to my ears because I've always been that way. But at the same time, I think there's still wisdom in finding some kind of specialty, something special that you bring to the game that others don't. And in this onslaught of information overload, focusing, if you can become like the go-to expert on this one aspect that you get curious about, I think that could help people a lot as well.
Yep, I agree, absolutely. And I think that our idea of what a specialist is and a generalist is evolving, because you can be a generalist that's a specialist. And I know that's a weird thing to say, but I do believe that's true.
No, I think you're exactly right. I would love to noodle on that sometime, but I think you're right. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Larry. I really appreciate your joining us today, giving us all this great information. It was really fun. I learned some new things too. A lot of new things, actually.
Thanks. And I learned stuff from myself, because I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. Because like I said, I'm just immersed in it. I don't get to reflect that often. So thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, that's great. And I want to thank the sponsors of the Content Matters podcast, Discover CX by Ingenix is built for teams that need to deliver customer portals, help docs, and success sites. It lets you write once and use everywhere, pull your content together from different sources, and it has a content delivery publishing ability to publish to different channels. So things like built-in XML authoring, data, AI, customer portal, has this delivery, everything you need to kind of keep clear content, consistent, easy to find, and modern way to deliver the customer experience. I encourage you to check out ingenious.com or discovercx.com to learn more about what they offer, and sign up for our newsletters at those sites. I help them produce their newsletters on LinkedIn, and we keep you up to date on all the new podcast guests that are coming up and any other interesting content in the kind of content strategy, content technology spaces. There was so much. There's too much to cover. But anyway, thank you everyone for joining us today, and thanks, Larry. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Barb.